You just focus on the bricks. Caitlin. Vanessa has the vision. My mother, Susan, said it with a smile that felt more like a scalpel, slicing the dinner table conversation into two unequal halves. I looked down at my plate. The perfectly roasted asparagus, suddenly looking gray. Across the curated dining room of the luxury Chicago condo, my sister Vanessa beamed, swirling her red wine. She was the artist, the dreamer, the consultant who sold lifestyles she couldn't afford. I was the architect, the one who dealt with load-bearing walls and permits, the one who was boring, but also the one who had quietly wired $4,800 into my father's account on the first of every month for 4 years. Then maybe Vanessa's vision can pay your $4,800 rent this month, I said. The words didn't come out loud. They just slid into the silence like a steel beam locking into place. My father? Gary stopped chewing. His fork hovered halfway to his mouth. Rent, he asked, a genuine confusion clouding his face. We own this place. Caitlin. I looked at him, then at my mother, whose face had gone the color of ash. No. Dad, you don't. And as of tonight, neither do I. I stood up, my chair scraping against the expensive hardwood floor, a floor I had paid to polish. The air in the room felt thin, brittle. I didn't wait for the explosion. I just walked out. Stop scrolling for a second. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been the one paying the bills while someone else gets all the credit? I want to know I'm not the only one. Hello? I'm Caitlin. I didn't wait for the elevator. I took the stairs, my heels clicking a sharp, staccato rhythm against the concrete, echoing like gunshots in the empty stairwell. By the time I pushed open the heavy lobby doors and stepped out onto the street, the Chicago wind hit me. It was a physical thing, a wall of ice coming off Lake Michigan that stripped the breath right out of my lungs. Good. I needed the cold. I needed to freeze the part of me that wanted to turn back, apologize, and fix it like I always did. But I wasn't fixing anything tonight. I stood on the corner of Michigan Avenue, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and steel around me. People rushed past, heads down against the wind. But I felt strangely still. For 29 years, I had been the fix, the safety net, the structural column that took all the weight so Vanessa could dance on the ceiling. But columns have a breaking point. And tonight, under the glare of a street lamp, I had finally snapped. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. I expected tremors, tears, the messy biological reaction to blowing up your own family. Instead, my fingers moved with the precision of a surgeon. Face ID unlocked the screen. I tapped the banking app icon. The blue logo pulsed for a second before revealing my balance. It was healthy, stable, exactly like me. I scrolled down to the recurring transfers list. There it was. Mom and Dad, condo, $4,800. Scheduled for the first of every month. I stared at the number. $4,800. That wasn't just rent. That was my freedom. That was the capital for my own firm. That was the cost of their love. A subscription fee I had been paying since I was 25. I tapped the edit button. The app asked if I wanted to modify the amount. I didn't want to modify it. I wanted to eradicate it. I hit delete. A confirmation box popped up, asking if I was sure. I had never been more sure of anything in my life. I tapped yes. The line item vanished. Just like that. The financial beam holding up their lifestyle was gone. But I wasn't done. I opened my email app. I found the contact for the property management firm. Because that was the thing my parents never seemed to understand about leases. They require a legal signatory. And that signature was mine. I drafted a new email. Subject notice of lease termination for Unit 40B. I wrote the words clearly, without emotion. I, Caitlin, the sole leaseholder, am giving the required 60-day notice to vacate. I typed out the date. 60 days. That was 8 weeks. 8 weeks for Vanessa to find a vision that paid the bills. 8 weeks for my parents to realize that a luxury condo doesn't pay for itself. I hit send. The phone felt lighter in my hand. I looked up at the high-rise I had just walked out of. Somewhere on the 40th floor. They were probably still drinking wine, complaining about my attitude, assuring themselves that I would calm down and come back. They had no idea that the demolition charges had already been set. The countdown had started. I turned my collar up against the wind and started walking. I wasn't going home to cry. I was going home to sleep. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't carrying them anymore. The key to my apartment didn't jingle. It slid into the lock with a heavy climb. Solitary click. I pushed the door open and stepped into my 700-square-foot studio. It was a converted loft in a grittier part of town. The kind of place my mother called industrial chic when she wanted to be polite. And a dungeon when she'd had 2 glasses of Chardonnay. My bed was tucked behind a bookshelf. My dining room was a counter with 2 stools. It was small. It was quiet. And it cost 1/3 of what I paid for the view I had just walked away from. I sat on one of the stools and opened my laptop. The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating the spreadsheet I had hidden in a folder named Tax Documents. I opened it. It wasn't taxes. It was a ledger, line by line. I scrolled through the history of my own erasure. It started 4 years ago. My parents had sold the big house in the suburbs to downsize to the city. They wanted the lifestyle, the art galleries, the river walks, the proximity to Vanessa's studio. But 3 months in, my father, Gary, had pulled me aside. A temporary cash flow issue, he'd called it. Liquidity problems with the sale. Could I cover the rent just for a month or 2? I remembered the look in his eyes. Panic. Vulnerability. I wrote the check. 1 month turned into 6. 6 turned into 12. The liquidity problem became a permanent state of affairs. A silent agreement that I would pay for the stage while they performed on it. I scrolled to the bottom of the spreadsheet. The AutoSum cell stared back at me in bold. Black font. $230,000. $400. The air left the room. $230,000. That wasn't just money. That was a house. That was a retirement fund. That was the seed capital for the architecture firm I had been dreaming of starting since I was 22. I had poured it all into a hole in the sky, funding a life I wasn't invited to enjoy. For years, I had asked myself why I did it. Why did I stay in a studio apartment eating ramen while they ordered steak in a condo I paid for? Was I weak? Was I stupid? No. It was more complicated than that. I closed my eyes and let the truth settle in. In architecture, there is a concept called progressive collapse. It happens when a primary structural element fails, and the weight shifts to members that can't support it, bringing the whole building down. I had convinced myself that I was that primary element. I believed that my family was a fragile structure, and I was the only load-bearing wall. If I moved, if I stepped away, everything they were, their status, their happiness, their very identity would turn to rubble. They had trained me for this role. Since I was a child, I was taught that my value wasn't in being seen, but in bearing the weight. Vanessa was the facade, the glass, and the steel that caught the light. I was the rebar, buried in the concrete. Ugly. Cold. Invisible. But essential. I told myself that paying that rent was an act of loyalty. I told myself it was strength. I wore those invisible chains like they were medals of honor, convinced that my suffering was the glue holding us together. But tonight, looking at the cursor blinking on the screen, I realized the truth. I wasn't holding up a family. I was financing a delusion. I wasn't their foundation. I was their hostage. And the only thing that would collapse if I walked away was the lie. I saved the file. I didn't close it. I wanted to remember. I wanted to see the cost of my silence in black and white. Then I opened a new tab and typed in the URL for the state's business registration portal. If I wasn't paying their rent next month, I had $4,800 to spend. It was time to buy my own name back. The sun hadn't even cleared the skyline before the noise started. My phone vibrated against the nightstand. A relentless, angry buzz that drilled into the quiet of my studio. I didn't reach for it immediately. I made coffee first. I watched the steam rise from the mug, grounding myself in the physical reality of my own space before stepping into their chaos. When I finally picked up the phone, the notifications were stacked like a collapsing tower. 17 missed calls, 34 text messages, 3 voice notes from Vanessa. I pressed play on the first one. Vanessa's voice was high, tight, echoing slightly as if she was pacing in a bathroom. "You are so toxic. Caitlin, seriously. You couldn't stand that Dad was proud of me for 5 seconds. You had to make it about money. You ruined the whole vibe. You're just jealous because you don't know how to exist in a room without sucking the air out of it." I didn't feel angry. I felt like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. I swiped to the texts from my mother. They were frantic, riddled with typos. The rent check bounced. The landlord called. "This is embarrassing. Caitlin, fix the banking error immediately." Banking error. She couldn't even type the words "you stopped paying." In her mind, it wasn't possible. The laws of physics stated that the sun rose in the east and Caitlin paid the bills. For me to stop was a glitch in the matrix. I set the phone down and looked at my reflection in the dark window. For years, I had wondered how they could be this blind. How could they take my money every month and still look at me with such disdain? But as I watched the notifications continue to roll in, I finally understood. It wasn't blindness. It was a survival mechanism. Psychologists call it the trap of normalized cruelty, or cognitive dissonance. My parents had built their entire identity around the idea that Vanessa was the special one, the golden child who would elevate the family name. If they admitted that I, the boring, brick-focused, invisible daughter was the one funding their lifestyle, their entire narrative would shatter. Admitting I was the provider would mean admitting Vanessa was a failure. It would mean their investment in her potential was a bad bet. And people like my mother would rather destroy the truth-teller than face the truth. They needed me to be the villain so they could keep pretending Vanessa was the hero. I took a sip of coffee. It was black, bitter, and real. I didn't text back. I didn't try to explain or defend myself. I sat down at my laptop and opened a new document. I wasn't a daughter right now. I was a landlord dealing with delinquent tenants. I typed the header, "Notice to quit. Pursuant to the terms of the lease agreement dated August 1st, 2019. Notice is hereby given that your tenancy is terminated." I cited the clause regarding the leaseholder's right to non-renewal. I didn't mention feelings. I didn't mention the insults at dinner. I referenced Illinois state property codes and notification timelines. I redlined them out of my life with the same dispassionate precision I used to correct a floor plan. I printed the document. Then I pulled a fresh envelope from my drawer. I addressed it to my father, Gary, knowing that when he saw my handwriting, he would expect a check. He would expect an apology. He would expect the beam to go back under the load. Instead, he was getting an eviction. I sealed the envelope and mailed it, knowing the impact was coming. 3 days later, my father walked into my office, clutching a manila envelope like a shield. He tossed it onto my desk, insisting the condo deed they found proved everything was a mistake. I opened it. One glance was enough. "Dad, this isn't a deed. It's a JPEG," I said. The county stamp was pixelated. He looked genuinely confused. Years of letting my mother handle details had left him unable to tell real from fake. I turned my monitor toward him. "Here's the truth. The $500. 000 from the house sale didn't buy the condo. It was wired to V-Style LLC, Vanessa's failed fashion line." His face collapsed as he realized his entire retirement had been burned on his favorite daughter's vanity project. And I had been secretly paying their rent for 4 years so he wouldn't learn he was broke. 60 days later, I stood in the condo for the final inspection. Vanessa sobbed excuses. My mother begged. My father stared out the window. Shattered, I left the master key on the counter. "Goodbye," I said, closing the door on the life I'd been subsidizing. 2 weeks later, I stood on a construction site, my first major project as Caitlin Ellis Architects. As concrete poured into the foundation, I understood demolition is only the first step. Real justice is what you build afterward. The $4. 800 I used to spend covering their rent, now funded draftsmen. Software. And the future I was building brick by brick, something honest. Something mine. If you're ready to stop paying for someone else's illusion, share this story.